You're so much affiliated with Marcia, and you're so much affiliated with Marshall.
Ethics. I taught administrative ethics. We used to have such things in this country. And I taught a course in administrative ethics. And I couldn't find a book. I cast about for great administrative leaders, ethical leaders, and I couldn't find any. And I knew that Marshall lived just up the road in Uniontown. That's where he came from. And it was a natural. So I decided to write the book about Marshall.
In your background, was your family in the law? Was there an inkling to get into that world?
No. I was always interested in politics and government. And so when after law school, I went to work for the California legislature. And I just got more and more interested in politics, and eventually that took me into teaching, and then military administration came up because of the connection with ethics that I was looking for.
Where were you born?
I was born in Cleveland, Ohio.
Cleveland, go Tribe.
They're the hottest team in the American League last 2 months.
So that's where you grew up?
Yeah. Right. Well, till I was age 6, and then I moved to Los Angeles.
Okay. And then when you worked for the California legislature, who was the governor then?
Well, when I first went, Pat Brown, Jerry Brown's father, was governor. He was a terrific governor. And then he ran for re-election against Reagan and lost. And so I was in that holdover from Brown to Reagan, so I was there part of each.
What was your role in that legislature?
I worked for the legislative analyst, so I would do budget analyses and legal analyses of some of the bills mostly for revenue effects.
Had Proposition, whatever it was called, had that been passed by then?
No, you mean was it Prop 13?
Prop 13, yeah, I forget.
No. Hadn't come up yet. But I did work with tax equalization, and we got a very strong bill in California, which Reagan couldn't stand.
How did you find yourself to West Virginia?
How did I find myself? Well, when Marcia and I came out of Syracuse School, it was one of the jobs that was open, and I went down to interview, and it so happened that the dean of the college into which I was hired was my former dean at Northern Arizona University. So that was a natural. And I liked the people, and I liked the program, and so it seemed like an easy thing to do.
In your bio, Jerry, you were part of the Air Force Judge Advocate Corps attorneys. What was your role there?
Mostly trial work. I was a claims officer too, but defense and prosecution, about 2/3 of my work was defense.
Court martials?
Courts martial, yeah. Mm-hmm.
What was the most normal thing that happened? Just AWOL or?
Yeah, AWOLs, barrack thefts, probably AWOLs more than anything.
How'd you find the due process of a military tribunal as opposed to what we would know in a kind of a public criminal tribunal?
So I think due process was very, very carefully done in the military. I know the Uniform Code of Military Justice was strictly followed. I don't know how it is all over the country, but I would assume it's the same. I think I had a high regard for the UCMJ, and I think people were handled fairly, and I thought it was a good system. Being
such a legend in West Virginia, your path, and I know our paths crossed here at Chautauqua. With Ken Heckler, did your paths cross with him before?
Oh yes, Ken taught political science down at Marshall, and I was teaching public administration with some undergraduate courses in political science at WVU, so it was a natural. You know, we'd see each other at conferences, and he came up to speak at WVU, and we saw each other a lot.
As an activist, I mean, we know his story, and he just, of course, passed away recently. what was he, how was he deemed in West Virginia? Was he's,
He was the people's politician. I remember Marcia and I went to the State House once, and we were looking for his office and asked where we could find the Secretary of State's office. And so we were pointed down a hall, and we went down there, and we looked inside a door, and he was sitting in a desk right by the door. And all of the secretaries and people that worked for him were in the back, and he was up front greeting the people.
wow.
That's the kind of guy he was. And when he ran for governor, he drove around a little Jeep and shook a million hands, and he was just the most accessible kind of guy you can imagine.
Well, he certainly has a biography of meeting people and being parts of so many things, from Truman to Jackson to Nuremberg to you name it. Somehow he
Herman Goering.
Herman Goering, Martin Luther King. That
Yeah,
March
Martin
in
Luther
Selma.
King, right.
You can't make that stuff up.
No, amazing man.
So now that you've sort of cast your lot as a scholar of George Marshall, at some point you had to say, well, I know a little about this guy, but I better dig deep. Was there an aha moment? I mean, I know you were doing the book on looking for ethics, but why George Marshall?
Because he was from nearby, Uniontown, and it was only 25 miles up the road from where I taught. And I stumbled across an article in a book. It compared J. Edgar Hoover with Marshall. And it was like night and day, of course, black and white. And I read some things about Marshall that I hadn't known before. And he was a local figure, and I needed a book on ethics for my class, and I had my subject.
How much did you learn about him that was, there's the World War II persona, and then there's the pre- and post-war persona.
Yeah, most people hear of Marshall in connection with the Marshall Plan, but he had a very distinguished record from 1902 on. And he had a 50-year long government career, and every year was marked by achievement. He's just an amazing guy. And he was a very important figure in World War I. He was called the genius of logistics in World War I. And he revolutionized Army officer training in the late 20s and 30s. And he created the Women's Army Corps, and on and on. He fought black and knee-side troops in World War II. He was one of a kind.
The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, read about it, and was that his brainchild?
No, that came about because he was at Fort Benning, and then at Fort Screven and Moultrie in South Carolina and Georgia in the early 30s, when the CCC, when the Civilian Conservation Corps, was created. And MacArthur was chief of staff at the time. Roosevelt went to MacArthur and said, "I'd like you to run the CCC for us." And MacArthur basically said, "That's not something the Army should do," and reluctantly took it on. Roosevelt was not happy with Marshall for that and other reasons. And so, but Marshall, as part of his duties, he became the head of the Southeast region for the CCC development. And he took to it like a duck to water. He loved it. It was his favorite role in his life, working with young men and salvaging their careers.
And that became somewhat of a model for the citizen-based mass army, right?
Absolutely. That plus the National Guard. He did groundbreaking work with both the CCC and the National Guard. And from working with those, he could envision how to train an army in a shorter time using methods that were even better than the ones that were used with the regular army types. So he could envision building a huge army in a relatively short time if you put enough resources into training and education.
During that time period, we were in a period of neutrality, and certainly building up a citizen-based army was not high on the priority of some of the policymakers. Did Marshall, did he have conflicts over that, saying, hey, we need to be ready, and then
Oh, you bet.
we're not being ready?
Yeah, he became chief of staff on the day World War II started, September 1st, 1939. And America was not ready to go to war. And if you look up the road at Chautauqua, you see Roosevelt making a speech in 36, I hate war speech. And the Congress is isolationist, and the public is totally against war. And there's no money appropriated for the Army, and there's just no appetite for war. Marshall expected that we would have to go to war, and he knew that his job was to try to prepare the country in this climate for war. And the most amazing period of his life, I think, is that period from September 1st, 1939 to December 7th, 1941. When Pearl Harbor came, sure, Marshall could get appropriations, he could pretty much do what he wanted. But until that time, he had an uphill fight and to try to help the British and the French and build an army and try to get a draft and so
In your
forth.
research, did you find Marshall at all involved in that, transfer of ships, up for bases, that was in 1940? Was Marshall part of that?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, he did some work with Robert Jackson on that, laying the groundwork for that.
I know at one point if you haven't read it, get the book William Casto just wrote on advising the president, Robert H. Jackson and Franklin Roosevelt. It's
Okay.
It's at the bookstore. And maybe we have an extra one here we'll give to you. It's fascinating about that particular time period and all the nuances that Jackson tried to work. I mean, there was like 5 or 6 ways to try to get
Try to
the
get
end.
around the Neutrality Act and all of that.
And, and trying to, at some point, they could actually, there was a 1890s law that said they could actually sell unused or obsolete ships to a private contractor, and then there was no restrictions about private contractors selling to Britain. But that was a gimmick. But Jackson was going down that road. The only condition was the head of the U.S. Navy had to sign off.
And there's a good discussion in John Barrett's book on destroyers for bases.
Right.
Too.
And the U.S. commander would not sign off. He's like, what? The president wants you to sign off. Just sign off. So
Yeah,
anyways,
they worked together on that.
yeah?
They did do some work together,
Yeah.
Marshall and Jackson.
Were there other opportunities for Marshall and Jackson? I'm just thinking about, because I know Jackson sort of soon became a member of the court, and it gets awkward.
There may have been just before Nuremberg, but Marshall was kind of going out the door at that time and looking for real estate and retirement, and didn't have too much to do with that. I'm sure he had some responsibility through his staff that must have worked with the occupation authorities and General Clay in the American zone in Germany. They had to have had worked together.
During his time of the World War I, and then subsequently, of course, into World War II, Eisenhower, Patton, Bradley were all kind of those veterans of both. What was his relationship with them? Let's just take them one at a time. What was his relationship
Let's
with
take
Eisenhower?
Patton.
Patton, okay, Patton.
Patton he met when he was basically the dean of the Army Infantry School in Fort Benning from 27 to 32. And Patton was an instructor, came as an instructor. Marshall concluded that Patton was the best damn soldier in the Army, but could not be trusted in peacetime. But he wanted him to have a top-level position as a tank commander in World War II, but he was very careful to put him under Bradley and Eisenhower. He didn't want Patton in control.
What about Eisenhower?
Eisenhower appealed to, he met Eisenhower rather later, around 39. Eisenhower had been assigned to head these huge field exercises in Louisiana, multi-state field exercises in 39 and 40. And Marshall was a big proponent of large-scale maneuvers. And he watched very closely how those proceeded. And he very much admired Eisenhower's work. And then he brought Eisenhower in the War Plans Division as soon as he became Chief of Staff. And he was so impressed that he fast-tracked promotions for Eisenhower in the Congress. Got him promoted 3 times in 2 years. And then sent him to London to head the European Theater of Operations. And he wanted to see how we would get along with Churchill. And they get along very well. And that was another thing that very much impressed Marshall about moving Eisenhower up and up.
Ultimately, I'm not even sure, how does Eisenhower be designated as the chief commander of the armed forces, the Allied armed forces? How does that work? How did that work?
Well, the assumption was that Marshall would have that position. It was always assumed that Marshall would be the Pershing of the Second World War. But, and a lot of commanders that were consulted, like Hap Arnold in the Air Force, and Churchill, and Stimson, Secretary of War, they all said Marshall's the guy that should lead this. But there was one outstanding exception, Pershing. Pershing contacted Roosevelt and said, there's only one man that can run a 2-front or multi-front war from Washington, and that's Marshall. No one else can do this job. And you should keep Marshall in Washington. And so Roosevelt sent feelers, constant feelers. If only Marshall would say what he wanted. If Marshall said, I want that job, he would have had it. Marshall refused to commit himself because he thought that was Roosevelt's decision to make. The war wasn't about Marshall, he said. It was about winning it as soon as possible with the least losses.
Do you get a sense that Churchill had a say in this?
Yeah, Churchill wanted Marshall to lead Operation Overlord. And so eventually Roosevelt had to sit down with Marshall, and he said, I won't be able to sleep if you're not in Washington. Who do you recommend for the job? And he said, Eisenhower.
That's how it happened.
But had Frank Andrews survived, Frank Andrews was the second top airman. Had General Andrews survived, he died in an airplane accident in Iceland in '43. Very likely, Marshall would have chosen Andrews. He thought he was our top officer. And, but Andrews had died, and another officer, British officer, who Marshall was very high on, a guy by the name of Morgan, Frederick Morgan, general, British general. Because Marshall, had he gone to Europe, would have brought Morgan in as his chief of staff in Europe. At that point, Churchill said, no, this should be an American operation because you've got most of the troops, most of the supplies. This is basically an American operation. This should be an American commander.
So Eisenhower's the #1 dog. And how did it go from there? Eisenhower,
Bradley,
then what?
Patton, Clark, the third tier was Patton, Clark, Hodges, Truscott, and others. Those were the sort of the major lieutenant general class.
That was from the U.S. side. Now, what was the coordinated line with Montgomery? Was he the #1 British guy?
Yep, Montgomery was the field marshal.
Okay.
And that's, by the way, since he was field marshal, the Congress wanted to pass an act during World War II making Marshall a field marshal. And Marshall said, no way in the world I'm going to be called Marshall Marshall. And so he says, besides, I don't need a 5th star to deal with these people. I'm awarded and rewarded enough. So they kept playing on him, and he said, well, okay, if you expand the people that will move to this 5th star, which should include Nimitz, Eisenhower, Bradley, and I think there were 7 in all, maybe Halsey, then he'll support it, but he didn't want it.
Was that a sense of humility? Was it a sense of naivete? Was it a sense that, regarding just the pecking order of how Roosevelt worked, and playing him, because we know that Roosevelt was very good at getting opinions from everybody, playing off everybody.
He played his cards very close to the
Very close,
vest.
yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, there's a little-known hero of World War II. His name was Sir John Dill. He was the head of the chief of the British Imperial Staff at the beginning of the war, but Churchill didn't like him. So Churchill wanted to pack him off to India. Marshall loved this guy. They were 2 peas in a pod, he and Dill. And so Marshall contrived to keep Dill in Washington by having Yale University recognize him as an outstanding American and giving him awards and speak and so forth. And then he flooded Churchill with these laudatory comments about Dill. And Churchill said, okay, you can stay in Washington. But what Dill did, Dill had all these contacts with the British chiefs. So Roosevelt wasn't telling Marshall what he was thinking, but he was telling Churchill. Churchill would share with his chiefs of staff. They'd leak it to Dill, and Dill would put it in Marshall's ear in Washington. And by the same token, Marshall, instead of going through Roosevelt, could whisper to Dill, and Dill could let the British chiefs know what Marshall was thinking.
What was Marshall's view about Montgomery?
It was a pain in the neck, but that he didn't want to interfere with Eisenhower. One of Marshall's basic tenets was you don't fool, you don't mess with the commanders in the field. You pick good people and you give them as much space and let them do what they can. You supply them and you help them. You don't second guess them.
When the war was over, did he ever kind of reflect in any sort of autobiography about wishing he was on the front?
No, he refused to write his memoirs. He was offered $1 million to do so, and he turned it down. Why?
Why?
He felt he was rewarded by the Army enough. He didn't want more. He didn't want to write about things that the Army had given him and his life in the Army, and went and get a lot of money for doing something which was always his duty. And secondly, he said if he wrote his memoirs, he would have to be honest about a lot of things, and that would hurt some people who basically devoted their lives to the military. I'm sure he would have written critical things about many people, but he kept those things to himself. He never shared those.
We know him by the Marshall Plan.
Yeah.
What's the genesis of the plan which bears his name?
He was, as soon as he became Secretary of State in early 47, he went to the Foreign Ministers Conference in Moscow. And while he was there, Truman floated the Truman Doctrine, which was military aid to Greece and Turkey as a way of meeting communist influence in those countries. Marshall didn't like that. He saw the beginnings of an arm race. He didn't like that. He thought that we should not challenge the Soviets like that. What he wanted was to do something positive, do a positive economic program as a way of propping up democratic countries in Europe. And so when he got back to the United States, he and George Kennan and Robert Lovett began to work on a plan for European recovery, which focused on letting the Europeans identify the needs. American money, Europeans working together to identify their needs, and then American technical support under Averill Harriman to go to Europe and put all that together. So that's how it came about. But he still needed help because it was a Republican Congress. And the Soviets helped by interfering in Europe.
Sure.
That was some help. But also, Marshall got buy-in from Senator Arthur Vandenberg, the Republican head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And Vandenberg did a lot of the footwork in Congress, but Marshall testified almost on a weekly basis.
Could you give us a Reader's Digest of what the plan was?
Okay, 13.6 billion. Sounds like chicken feed now, doesn't it?
Yeah, a lot of
It's
money.
big money. It was, you had to have the Europeans had to meet and identify their needs and certify those to the Americans. The Americans then would fund those needs, and you would have a nation by nation technical advisory corps set up by the Americans to go to each European country and oversee how that aid was dispersed and spent. So each country determined how much it wanted and what it would use it for, and then the Americans oversaw its expenditure through the Economic Recovery Agency. I think it was called the ERA or ECA or Economic Cooperation. I forget exactly the moniker, but it was run by Paul Hoffman, who was a former president of Studebaker. And Hoffman worked with Marshall during the war on a lot of production of war materials, so he was well known and very, very popular with the Republicans, and Marshall liked him very much and trusted him, so that's the way it went. Marshall never had anything to do with the administration of the program, only selling it and thinking it through.
The countries that were impacted by this were all allies? I mean, at this point, because the Iron Curtain...
Well, that's interesting you should ask that. Mostly yes, but the way it was designed, and he got input from George Kennan, for the great planner, the containment theory. George Kennan was the chief of planning for the State Department. Kennan recommended that it be open to the Soviet Union and all the Eastern Bloc countries, that they could get aid in the Marshall Plan. And of course the question arose, well, wouldn't that kill the plan? So much money, why would you give money to these people that are starting to interfere in European affairs? So Kennan and Marshall agreed, was that they probably would stay out of it anyway. And they were right. So the French and the British responded first. They put together the whole organization, I think 16 countries. They invited the Soviets to join. Czechoslovakia very much wanted in, and Poland too, I think. And Stalin saw it as a lot of, he didn't want to sacrifice sovereignty. He didn't want to get into this European organization and give up his prerogatives. So he stayed out, and he warned these other nations to stay out, or they could expect to have retribution from the Soviets. So they all dodged it. And as a matter of fact, the Marshall Plan was part of the reason that Stalin created the Warsaw Pact and the Eastern Bloc of countries and started the Cold War and the blockade of Berlin.
So the flow itself came from the United States. Did it go into each individual country, or was there one organization which sort of oversaw the 16?
country by country, U.S. to each nation individually. The British put all their money into reducing balance of payments. And others did other things. The Italians put a lot of money into agricultural production, egg production, amazing. The Dutch built a lot of seaports. Every nation kind of went in a different direction. But every nation that decided what it wanted to do, it arrived at it in part through discussions and consultation with American technical assistance. So this was one of the ways that the Marshall Plan was sold. They knew that the Europeans would be coming to American entrepreneurs and production for a lot of this production, and this would build American markets abroad.
Germany, the use of the Marshall Plan in Germany, did it have political feedback? I mean, there certainly was a feeling that to the victor the spoils, and these guys, Germans especially, and then they got complicated by, of course, the Cold War and the Iron Curtain. As the politics were playing out in the United States,
oh yeah,
I assume there wasn't unanimity.
No. One example, Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, wanted to see Germany forced to become an agricultural country. And he very much opposed any sort of rebuilding or of industrial potential in Germany. And that became a very hot issue. Part of the history of the Marshall Plan was its connection to the European coal and steel community, which kind of was a fallout from the Marshall Planning. And that basically was the first time that France and Germany had cooperated on anything in about 2 centuries. They began to decide how that production would go, that both countries absolutely had to have an increase in steel production. And so the Germans and the French worked it out as sort of an offshoot of the building of the Marshall Plan organization.
Was there a termination at some point when the Marshall Plan had,
Yeah.
what was that time period?
It was supposed to be a 4-year plan. And they funded the first 2 years, but then American policy began to shift in 1950 with the building of NATO. And so you got some of the appropriations that were supposed, toward the end of that 4-year period, they were supposed to go into the Marshall Plan. They started to move into NATO military expenditures. So it did shift somewhat. But the European nations were already on the road to recovery, partly the Marshall Plan and partly other economic conditions were changing. And some economists said the Marshall Plan didn't do that much for Europe, and others said it did everything. So there's all sorts of disagreement in the economic community.
One of the more interesting things when you look at the history of certainly Indochina time period is that Marshall's role in brokering a peace between the nationalists, which are Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, which were Mao Zedong. How do you do that?
That's an amazing chapter, which doesn't get enough attention. Marshall retired in November of '45. He went to buy a home in Pinehurst, North Carolina. He and his wife came home to Leesburg, Virginia. The phone was ringing. Truman, will you go to China for me? He looks up, makes sure his wife's upstairs unpacking. She isn't hearing the conversation. He says, yes, sir. He goes to China. And Wedemeyer and others said, you're crazy. You don't have a prayer of bringing about a negotiation or peace between these. They hate each other. As a matter of fact, Chiang Kai-shek was stockpiling all the aid he was getting from America during the war. He was going to use it against Mao after the war, and he wouldn't fight. He wouldn't fight the Japanese. He expected Claire Chennault and the Flying Tigers to do that, and the Americans would take care of the Japanese. But where was I?
Chiang Kai-shek.
Chiang Kai-shek, to work with Chiang Kai-shek and Mao was tough. Chiang Kai-shek was basically a corrupt fascist and was undermining the negotiations at every turn. Marshall wasn't really surprised because he was getting a different story from the interpreters. And one of the interpreters was Madame Chiang, who was misinterpreting things that Chiang was saying. And this was later made public by the actual translator, who was pushed out of the room by Madame Chiang sometimes. So there was a lot of treachery by the corrupt backers of Chiang.
Wow.
And initially, Marshall got on great terms with Zhou Enlai, the number 2 guy.
Yeah.
And they were really moving. They got a ceasefire. They worked out in the court in how the government was to be organized. And they were moving on to number 3, which was the tough one, building an integrated national army that neither side would control, and that's where it broke down. And then Stalin got involved and undermined it. And then Chiang did an end run around Truman and Marshall and went to the Republicans in Congress and got support from them. And the whole thing kind of became a shambles. And Marshall stayed with it for about a year and finally gave it up.
Wow, that is fascinating.
It is. But he learned great skills while he was there. He was negotiating and he was picking up a lot of the skills that he would use when he was Secretary of State.
And he was Secretary of State under Truman until Truman really is term ended, right?
Yeah, about 2 years he was Secretary of State until Truman left in early, well, he would have stayed on probably, but he was ill, and so he left in early '49.
North Korea really hadn't, Korea conflict hadn't really fired up when he was there.
Right, and when Marshall left Secretary of State, his survival was in question, and then he recovered. And Truman appointed him as head of the American Red Cross. And so he ran the Red Cross, and Truman thought this is a cushy job, a little status, something for him to do. He ran with it. He visited all 250 Red Cross agencies around the U.S., including Hawaii, and he resuscitated the reputation of the Red Cross. And he started to plan for a huge junior Red Cross movement around the world with some 19 million young women and girls to provide disaster relief, kind of like a giant Peace Corps or something.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was starting to think about that when the Korean War started. And Truman asked him to become Secretary of Defense, so he came out of the Red Cross and went to work for the Defense Department.
So how did he envision MacArthur? I mean, they got this whole Truman, MacArthur. Where does Marshall play in all of this?
Well, he thought MacArthur was a great strategist. Personally, he was a pain in the neck. He once called MacArthur a very, very difficult man, and Marshall's staff officer said that's like swearing for Marshall. So he had problems with him, but he stuck with him. After the war, he said, let's keep MacArthur in Japan. I'll support him, see how he does. And MacArthur did a wonderful job in Japan. And then when the Far East Command came up, when the United Nations coalition began the war against Korea, Marshall said, we should stick with MacArthur. And they did, although Marshall was out of the military business by then. He was on the civilian side, so Bradley was really running things. So they stuck with MacArthur, and Marshall thought he did a wonderful job. He was amazed at how successful MacArthur was in the Incheon landing and broke the stranglehold around Pusan and really changed the war. But then when MacArthur began to develop his own foreign policy and wanted to bring in the nationalist Chinese and attack over the Yalu and bomb the China and was working with the Republican side of Congress and hatching some of these ideas, Truman finally had it up to here. And then the Chinese came into the war and were slaughtering American troops. Truman finally said to to Marshall, I want you to review the record. Here's all the correspondence, everything that's happened over the last 2 years. And Marshall took it home on a weekend and went to see Truman on Monday morning, and he said, you should have fired him 2 years ago. So, but when MacArthur came home after he was removed, and he came home to give the famous Old Soldiers Never Die speech to Congress, there was one member of the administration that met him at Langley when he landed. Marshall.
Okay. Wow. You know, you're an amazing piece of history here, Jerry. You're tying in all these kind of loose ends, and
Yeah, even Marshall doesn't know a lot of these things.
yeah, you sent me a two-pager about your views about Marshall, and one of them concluded, Marshall, along with Robert H. Jackson and others, are rightly celebrated as major players in America's dominant world role as the leaders of liberal democracies in opposing totalitarian governments and building peace based on humanitarian and democratic ideals. And then going on to say, this model, in large measure on regional military and economic alliances, strong national defense force preparedness, and humanitarian and democratic principles, have been the dominant paradigm in American foreign policy through the balance of the 20th century.
Right.
Then you say, presently, its relevance and durability is being tested by nationalist and isolationist movements.
Yes.
Talk to me about the last sentence.
In Europe, in South America, in Asia, and in the United States, there's rising tides of isolationism, dissatisfaction with international organizations, withdrawal from the Paris Peace Accord, Climate Accord, withdrawal from nuclear arms agreements, trade barriers, including tariffs, interference with refugee movements, reluctance, especially in Europe, to take refugees, and a lot of anti-humanistic kinds of policies that are in place in Europe and in the United States and around the world. And I see that as a rising trend. We're going to be voting on it next year, I think. I think that's the dominant issue in American politics right now.
Ethical leadership in turbulent times. Obviously, we live in turbulent times. And you use George Marshall as the model off of which much could be learned. And as your book, I enjoyed it immensely. Do you think anybody else in the administration is reading this? Current administration?
I hope so. I know some of them are writing books about Marshall.
Yeah.
David Petraeus, for one.
Yeah.
And Colin Powell is a great devotee of Marshall. And he's inspired so many military leaders. I don't know of any military leader that doesn't have a portrait of Marshall on the wall. I don't know whether they're reading my book. I don't know. I'll tell you, someone who just read the book and contacted me was his granddaughter.
Ah.
Kitty Wynn, out in Ojai, California.
You do work with the Marshall Foundation?
Yes.
And talk a little bit about the Marshall Foundation. I'm not sure everybody really knows what that is.
The Marshall Museum and Library was established by Congress under Truman's influence back in, I think, '52. And it's right on the right between the campuses of VMI and Washington and Lee in Lexington, Virginia. And it's an institution which recognizes Marshall's legacy, and it's also a center for training, and so the Marshall Foundation has been, and there are many famous people that have served on the Marshall boards, including Colin Powell and all the military brass from prior years. So it's been that kind of organization. They have recently built, in the last 10 years, they built a George C. Marshall Center for Leadership and Ethics. And they have a lot of events there where Marcia and I went to an event just before Election Day in 2016, in which the former Secretary of State Baker spoke, James Baker. What was it, James?
James, yeah.
Yeah. And McMasters, who served as head of the National Agency for Security,
Right.
NSA, in the Trump administration. He was there, and so you get a lot of interesting mixes there. A lot of it's conservative based, but it's military conservative, and so it's kind of a hotbed.
You've taught there, haven't you?
I've done a lot of lectures. As a matter of fact, I'm supposed to speak on August 29th there on. They asked me to speak on Marshall and Israel.
Ah.
Not a topic which is talked about too much.
Okay, you want to give us a sneak preview?
Well, I started to write about the subject because over the years at the Everett Jewish Life Center, we'd talk about Marshall, people would see the book or something, and they'd say, great man, but he was an anti-Semite, wasn't he? And this would drive me nuts, this nonsense. But Marshall had opposed Truman on the unilateral recognition of Israel when the British were ruling. But there was a different agenda. Marshall thought that Israel would be destroyed, that the Jews would be destroyed, and that the British acting on the sides of the Arab Legion and so forth would bring this tremendous firepower against the Jews, who would be outgunned in 50-to-1 ratio of manpower. Didn't think they had a chance. So he supported, instead of the partition, he and the UN delegation, which included Eleanor Roosevelt, Adlai Stevenson, Dean Rusk, they all backed another approach, which was a UN trusteeship, which would buy time to get some sort of maybe a binational leadership established in Palestine, which was the only way they thought that possibly, it probably wouldn't work, but if it is the only way to avert a war. And so in 1990, Clark Clifford, who was part of Truman's office at the time, had been insulted by Marshall when they were going through that period, and felt very abused by Marshall. Clark Clifford came out with a book in 1990, which in essence said that Marshall was giving into the anti-Semitism of the State Department. So there's a really dark history involved there, but Marshall was hardly an anti-Semite. He fought to have an assistant secretary of defense named, who was named Anna Rosenberg, in the same year that the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were put to death. And it was opposed by the Senate. And he told his people in the Defense Department, he'll work for Anna Rosenberg or he won't work for me. And he fought for her, and she became a valuable addition to his staff during the Korean War. And he also supported a bill in Congress that would have brought 140,000 Jews directly to the United States, which the House defeated. But he was one of the people that worked for them. So he wasn't an anti-Semite, and it's very unfair.
In fact, you conclude by, in your book, it says, Marshall's role in the decision remains controversial, but the key point is that in the end, he recognized his role as subordinate to the president's and acted accordingly.
Yeah, he wasn't happy with Truman's decision. And he said, if I were a voting man, and Marshall never voted in a national election, he said, if I were a voting man, I would not vote for you for president this year. And they were unhappy. Or Truman was not unhappy. He really needed Marshall to support whatever he did. And finally they patched it over somehow, and they moved on to other things. But it was a little dicey for a while. But the real problem was Clark Clifford's book in 1990, and it was basically co-written by Richard Holbrooke, who was Assistant Secretary of State, who kind of bought into that. And Holbrooke wrote his own piece, an anti-Marshall piece. So there are a lot of Jewish people out there who believe that Marshall was anti-Semitic, and that's why I want to talk about it, because I think that needs to be addressed.
Terrific. What's a question people normally would ask you, Jerry? You've been gracious and lending us your time now. But as we draw closure, is there a question that most people would ask that I should be asking you?
Yeah, what I get a lot is, shouldn't there be a Marshall Plan for this or that?
That's
Central
Plan.
America. Remember the Marshall Plan for Iraq in 2004. The conditions will probably never be the same for another Marshall Plan, and all that is just political hyperbole. It sounds good because the Marshall Plan was called by Churchill the most generous and successful act of statesmanship in world history. And so whoever it is, whether it be George W. Bush or whoever wants to kind of wrap themselves in this Marshall Plan flag and say this is what we should do. It's a popular slogan, and that's about all it amounts to now.
Well, and one of the things I pulled out for today was, in fact, that, the Marshall Plan for Central America. This is fantastic. So you want to say something really pleasant about Marcia here? You're nothing but for Marcia. We talked about Marshall, but you haven't talked about Marcia.
Mm-hmm.
Has she been, I know.
Marcia edited the book.
I was going to say, you did.
Yeah. How many times did you go over it?
Read the chapters about 7 or 8 times.
About 7.
Because every time I did a copy, Jerry changed something else, so I'd have to start at the beginning and read the whole chapter again.
God
See, it
bless.
starts off as an academic text, and as I rewrite and rewrite, it changes more and more into English. And Marcia accelerated that process greatly.
How long did it take you to write it?
About 7 years of work, but I was doing other things. I was teaching, yeah, writing in spare time.
Well, that's a quite good question, because I've interviewed a lot of folks who've written books, and
Yeah.
at some point you got to ask the question, how do you know when you've done enough to research? I mean, at some point you got to stop because it'll just keep coming.
When you get the contract and they tell you to stop writing,
Fair
I
answer.
still look at it and want to add to it, and you never find all the mistakes. They just galling to open a page and find a mistake. It's just really bad. I'll tell you one thing about stopping, though. It's like I've heard other biographers say this, that it's you go into a period of mourning because you're working with this character and you're reading all their letters and you're talking to their friends or reading interviews that have been done like you do. And that person is alive to you, and then suddenly you stop writing and you're working on the index, and it's like you enter a period of mourning. It's very difficult for people who love their subject.
Did you do your index?
Oh yeah,
Oh, my gosh.
A through Z. It's always a pleasure. In the past, I've run out and found a microphone so you could do an interview with someone else.
That's
And
right.
now I
We
get a
have done
chance
that.
to,
I sent you some pictures, hopefully you got them, with Gabriel Bach.
yes, thank you very much, Greg.
That-
I'll show them to you.
That was
Beautiful
magic.
pictures
That
of
was just a magic.
Bach and Eli Rosenbaum.
Well, thank you, thanks so much, Jim.
Thank you,
Appreciate it.
Greg.